Hi, everybody. I'm Allison Bainbridge, your host for this afternoon's Book Passage virtual event. I want to thank you so much for tuning in with us. I've been really looking forward to this event for several reasons, not the least of which, as I mentioned to the author beforehand, is that this book has an incredibly gorgeous cover. And yes, we sometimes do judge books by their covers. Another is that the two people that you will be hearing from today are incredible experts in their fields. And finally is that though we have many immediate concerns as a species on this planet right now, as a resident of Northern California, the lack of water is a huge cause of anxiety for us. And I think that the history of water in our world feels like a very relevant subject right now. Spanning millennia and continents, our author Giulio Boccaletti gives us a stunningly revealing history of civilization in his book, Water, a Biography. Giulio shrewdly combines environmental and social history, beginning with the earliest civilizations of sedentary farmers on the banks of the Nile, the Tigris, and the Euphrates Rivers. We see with clarity how irrigation structure informs social structure inventions such as the calendar sprung from agricultural necessity, how in ancient Greece the communal ownership of wells laid the groundwork for democracy, how the Greek and Roman experiences with water security resulted in systems of taxation, and how the modern world as we know it began with a legal framework for the development of water infrastructure. Extraordinary for its monumental scope and piercing insightfulness, Water, a Biography, richly enlarges our understanding of our relationship to and fundamental reliance on the most elemental substance on Earth. In an effort to get right to the discussion, as a host, I highlight a few points from the discussants' bios. I have to say that in this case, it was really tricky to narrow it down because both our participants have extraordinary backgrounds. Giulio is a globally recognized expert on natural resource security and environmental sustainability. He's an honorary research associate at the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment at the University of Oxford. He trained as a physicist and climate scientist. He holds a doctorate from Princeton University, where he was a NASA Earth System Science Fellow. He's been a research scientist at MIT and was a partner at McKinsey & Company, where he was one of the leaders of its sustainability and resource productivity practice, and the chief strategy officer and global ambassador for water at the Nature Conservancy, one of the world's largest environmental organizations. Giulio lives in London and frequently writes on environmental issues for various news media outlets. We're also very honored to have Lynn Scarlett join us today as the In Conversation partner. Lynn is Chief External Affairs Officer at the Nature Conservancy, and in this role, she influences climate and conservation policy in the US and 72 countries and territories in which TNC operates. With the corporate engagement team, advances private sector partnerships to support sustainability and enhance ambitious actions to address climate change. Prior to her role at the Conservancy, Lynn was the Deputy Secretary Chief Operating Officer at the U.S. Department of the Interior, where she also served as Acting Secretary of the Interior in 2006. She's authored many articles for environmental publications and currently serves as a board member for a wide range of organizations. And that actually is just the tip of the iceberg as far as their extensive accomplishments. However, with further ado, on to the discussion of Water, a Biography.
Thank you so much, Allison, and welcome everybody. Giulio, it's just really great to join you for this conversation.
Lovely to be here. Good to see you.
The book Water, a Biography, it's a prodigious work with a central theme. And we often all think about water in terms of infrastructure. We think of dams, irrigation facilities, canals, and so forth. But your central theme is that the story of water is fundamentally not technological, but political. We see a cycle of institutional adaptation. And you note that humanity's relationship with water is etched into the fabric of society, our beliefs, our behaviors, institutions. And in this exploration of the history of water, the biography of water, you probe ideas of progress, ideas that modernization is a technical story, or it's a saga of capitalist, socialist dialectics, or so many other pathways. You build into this central thesis that the story of water is fundamentally political in many ways. But in doing that, you look at science, you look at geography, you look at political philosophy, you look at the intersecting histories of agriculture, industrialization, trade, many interwoven strands. I loved reading this, the story of water, the biography of water as you depict it, really gives us a sort of history of everything in many respects. But let me turn to you and ask you, so why the title? Why Water, a Biography?
Yeah, thanks, Lynn, and thank you for those kind words. I'm delighted you enjoyed the book. You know, the title was a difficult thing to come up with, I have to say. It was, at one point, I had a long list of 40 or 50 different titles from which I ended up having to choose. But this one seemed to resonate because, as you said in your opening remarks, you know, I really wanted to turn the camera around. So often the conversation about water is a conversation about techne, about the technique, about the way in which we transform the landscape, or the engineer that sort of changes the irrigation structures, or, you know, it's, and today in modernity, we talk about desalination, or we seek the next technology that's going to solve the water issue. And, you know, having worked on water issues, as you have, in fact, for many, many years, the more you work on it, the more you realize that in reality, we are the architects of both problem and solutions, and both problem and solutions are not really residing in the material, in the engineered landscape. They reside in the institutions, in the rules that we give ourselves, and in the habits that we have with respect to this this substance. And so, you know, as a book about water, so water had to be the title, but then I wanted to put the subtitle, this kind of a biography, because it's really a story of water and people. And it really tries to present kind of a millennial dance that human societies have been engaged in ever since we became sedentary, with this, which is probably the most powerful agent on the planet that operates on scales that are relevant to us. So that's really sort of the, you know, the origin of the title. And I think in a way it serves it well as a kind of lens and interpretation of kind of the entire history.
So, Giulio, you say it's a story of people in many respects, and I'm struck as I read the book that it's a story of people, but yes, ideas of identity that are tied to water, ideas of belief systems, and you help us understand that beyond the abstract by taking us on a tour through history, whether Egypt, Mesopotamia, Africa, of course, the United States and the West in the United States. So what do we inherit from that antiquity, that tale of water through time and place, the kinds of cultural traits and identities that have been shaped in juxtaposition to water? Yeah,
well, there's a lot there. You know, one of the things I wanted to do, you know, there have been many books that have been written about water, but they often tend to marvel at the sort of exoticism of ancient civilizations. So the story typically is sort of, you know, focused on just how different, how exotic some of the experiences of the deep past are. What I was doing was trying to do some sort of archaeology of ideas, try to find in the deep past those fragments, those things that we can still find in the present. And, you know, the first part of the book is pretty much about that, is about extracting from primary and secondary sources evidence that is relevant today of the experiences that people had in that past. And so I start, you know, I'll give you just a couple of examples just to get us going in this, but, you know, the first observation I had as I ventured into this work was the oldest information that we have about human society is carried by myths and stories, right? Stories, far more than facts, are persistent over time. In fact, at some point I read a story of the Klamath tribe, which you'll know well in southern Oregon, I think, that tells the story of Crater Lake. and its formation. And we know from geology that it was formed 6,000-7,000 years ago. So the stories can carry information that are 6,000-7,000-year-old information, And so when I started looking, I realized that most societies have at their origin water, at the heart of their origin, of the myth of origin, resides water. And I sort of started there. And, those of us who are familiar with the sort of Old Testament will be familiar with the story of Noah. But it turns out that the sort of great deluge that's represented in the biblical text is something that shows up in most societies, from the Mesopotamians in the Epic of Gilgamesh to, the Lenape of Mannahatta to, the Navajos to the Pachacuti flood in the Inca tradition. So every single society, the Chinese, the Jade Emperor of China, have this kind of flood myth at the start of their story, at the start of their history. And I think that, my inference from that is that, it's a fragment of our transition to sedentism. We became sedentary. Suddenly you discover you're trying to stand still in a world of moving water, and water becomes this really powerful agent around you that can really modify the landscape on scales that are immense. And from then on, from the moment of contemporary onwards, our problem becomes to modify and protect ourselves on the landscape at the scale that's defined by water issues. And so I start there, and then I can tell you other stories, but we go, as I said, from Mesopotamia to Egypt to then fundamentally, maybe we can talk about it in a second, but the issue of democracy and kind of the rise of the modern institutions. And so, I'll just close by saying that, one of the remarkable things about this is that if you read the ancient literature, I became far more expert in Mesopotamian stories than I ever expected I would. It turns out there's a far greater canon than I ever knew before starting writing this book. But whether it's Atrahasis or whether it's, as I said, the Epic of Gilgamesh, there are all these kind of fragments in the story of water that reside in the past, but that then have made it through the literature, through the culture, into the present. And that's part of the exercise that I embarked on with this book, was trying to recover those ideas and kind of frame them in a coherent whole.
So Giulio, you talk about myth, and you point to the flood myths that recur so many places across the world in various societies. But your central thesis about water also linking significantly to the development of institutions, and in particular political institutions. Yeah. And you mentioned that relationship between water and institutions and political discourse really kind of starts with the advent of sedentary agriculture. That is, people used to move around, they were nomads. If the water moved, they could move. If there was drought, they could go somewhere else. If there was flood, they could go somewhere else. But of course, when people became agriculturalists and stayed in one place, it introduced the challenge of how do you manage water so that you can avoid the risks of great floods, and or manage water for plenty so that you avoid the natural climate patterns of change and drought. So talk a little bit about that relationship between political institutions and water, and some of the key political themes or tensions that arise in that context.
Yeah, so as you say, we were hunter-gatherers and nomads for 95% of the time that Homo sapiens be on the planet. We appeared about 100,000 years ago, and we only became sedentary about 10,000 years ago. And that's really when, all of what we recognize as culture today starts. And it starts in the Levant, and it starts in the sort of southern Mesopotamian plains. Now, the story of how institutions emerge out of that is, in a way, almost mechanistic to tell, and it's not, it's been told in many ways, right? I mean, there's a famous book by Carl Wittfogel from ages ago that sort of made this point, which is that you start with a society that has to exercise collective action, right? If you are residing in a floodplain of the Euphrates or the Tigris, for that matter, the rivers produce work on the environment on scales that far transcend the individual. And that's true even today. I mean, Faulkner used to describe the Mississippi as that river that comes through your living room and takes away the piano. I mean, it's like there's a sense in which these rivers, these vast rivers, can be really, really powerful agents on the landscape at a scale that's far greater than anything individual can kind of manage. And so it's inevitable that in order to exercise collective action, build levees, create channels, et cetera, you need to have organization. It poses an organizational problem. And that organizational problem inevitably leads to the need for structure and for some distribution of power. And so the argument I follow in the book is not strictly deterministic. I don't make the argument that one causes the other, right? I want to be careful that I don't slip into environmental determinism, but it's no question that the way in which power in society is distributed is shaped by the needs of managing for agrarian societies, which is what we have been for the vast majority of our history. Until the 20th century, we were all agrarian societies. And for all of that time, the way in which power got distributed and shaped was, to a large extent, a function of organizing to hold back the river, to create, to create storage when there was none, and so forth and so on. Now, so that's the kind of simplistic version of this. And then what happens as you start looking in different parts of the world is that you can start conducting a sort of comparative history of sorts between the different societies that emerge and that face very, very, very different kind of hydraulic conditions. And so, just a few examples, but, for example, the Egyptians very interestingly acquire the idea of a nation. It's actually one of the first sort of societies to exhibit kind of national borders rather than city borders, which is what most of ancient societies had. Out of the fact that the state was essentially born out of managing the river in its entire length, from the cataracts down to the delta. We can talk more about that, but essentially the problem of managing transport over this enormous piece of natural infrastructure led to the design of the state to integrate cities and agriculture in one big national whole. That's very different from the experience of, North Israel or Judah, who were these states that emerged in the sort of 11th, 10th century in very, very arid environments, where the problem is more around kind of cooperation and market mechanisms to kind of overcome the scarcity of the environment. There's other examples. I mean, Mesopotamia has other examples like that. So one of the things I do in the first part of the book is examine the way in which different hydrologies ended up producing these different type of institutional responses. Interestingly, as an aside, I don't spend a lot of time in the book, but there's a very sort of towards the end of the first millennium BCE, the pre-classical Maya civilization starts developing in Mesoamerica. And there's increasing body of evidence around the way in which forest civilizations developed, which face particularly in the tropics, face a completely different hydrology from what you would face around the Mediterranean. And that's reflected in some of the kind of distribution in power and institutions that they seem to develop. So that was kind of the big theme. It turns out that you can extract all these different case studies and you can see all these different types of institutions emerging in different types of hydrologies. I then argue, and this is kind of an important point, this legacy of that first part of the book, that there is one hydrology that matters to us enormously, which is the hydrology of the Mediterranean. And why that is sort of interesting in its own right. And then, of course, the story of how that particular corner of the world, which at the time in the first millennium BCE wasn't all that remarkable compared to, Qing and Han China or other parts of the world, ends up becoming the kind of dominant template of the state across the world. How that happens occupies much of the rest of the book. But the hydrology of the Mediterranean is a particularly interesting sort of institutional context for the relationship between water and people.
So, Giulio, let's link these histories, if you will, to some of the challenges of the present. And I would like to explore this in a two-tiered set of questions. So, as we know, with the effects of a changing climate, we are seeing significant changes in precipitation patterns and really fairly rapid and dramatic shifts, in some cases resulting in increased frequency of high-intensity storms and these floods and these rainfall events that just have massive impacts, whether in Germany recently or China or the United States, or throw a dart on the map and we see these incidences. At the same time, we are also seeing extreme drought. Yes, of course, periodically through history, we've always had droughts. But my first question to you is, in the past, as civilizations have encountered drought, and in the context of sedentary agriculture, what have been some of the institutional mechanisms, albeit paired sometimes with technological innovations, reservoirs and so forth, that are instructive as we think about the present? And then, because many of our participants in this conversation are from California, a place that often experiences drought, you have in the west of the United States this interesting dynamic between the need to collectively manage water like the Colorado River, and yet a lot of institutions that are really rooted in individualism, the individual farmer managing that water. And yet the enterprise for addressing drought, managing that water, does require, as you noted earlier on, that collective action. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about past to present. What have we learned? Are there any institutional adjustments, adaptations that might be relevant today? But then also probe that a little bit further on some of the dynamics that we face in that tension between individual action, collective action, and addressing things like drought and flooding.
Yeah. Well, so there's a lot there. So in the first part, what do we learn from the past that's relevant to today? Well, I think there's many things actually, and I hope people will read the book and find out sort of the details. But there are three basic stories that I think are really important that have stuck with me. One is what we risk if we get it wrong. There's a famous event around the 12th century BCE, which was the collapse of the Bronze Age societies. Now, the Bronze Age is a bit of an archetype for modernity because it was a system of really powerful states connected by trade that operated across the Mediterranean and beyond, in fact, from Scandinavia all the way to India, quite wealthy, quite cosmopolitan. This was the time of the Hittites and the Mycenaean palaces and, the sort of Second Kingdom of Egypt and Ugarit and so forth and so on. And they all came crumbling down in response to a shifting climate, ostensibly. Or at least we see in the paleoclimatological record that there's a drop in precipitation and then decreasing temperatures all across the Mediterranean that corresponds with the disappearance of these societies. But then if you scratch the surface, what you realize is that the actual proximate cause of collapse isn't directly the experience of a changing climate. These societies, in many cases, were wealthy enough to survive that direct effect. But what happened was that the most vulnerable in that system, which in this case were pastoralists from the northern Balkans, they could not survive the changes in climate because they were far more vulnerable than anybody else. And their relationship to their sedentism, their relationship to landscape got unhinged and they started moving south. And as they did, they turned into what historians of the 19th century called the Sea People. And they are the sort of invaders that then caused the collapse of many of these civilizations, to the point that in the archaeological record, there's a layer around 1177 that actually speaks to that collapse. So the key lesson for the present is that the risks that we face in a changing climate are not necessarily tied to the biggest physical impacts, but they are tied to the physical impacts that befall on the most vulnerable. And so again, the camera needs to turn around. It's really a story of people. I say at one point in the book that the crises of water don't flow through the rivers, they flow through people, right? Through the institutions and through actually sometimes actual floods of people moving around. So that's kind of one insight. The two other things I would briefly touch on in kind of what we can learn in the past is, one of the most persistent and important influences from antiquity into the modern age in terms of water, oddly enough, is in one of this highest abstraction, which is the beliefs and morals that come through the biblical text. It turns out that the patriarchal generation that produced the Old Testament was, of course, wrestling with an incredibly scarce environment. And one of the things that happens in very, very scarce environments is that it's a real incentive to cooperation. And so a lot of the morality that emerges out of the Abrahamic tradition, which then seeds into the Christian tradition and the Muslim tradition, is one of deep cooperation, in part, not entirely. Again, I don't want to be overly deterministic, but in part because of the scarcity of the environment that they faced. And you can see this even in Jewish law. I mean, it's kind of interesting. I spent quite a bit of time on this in the book. And so for the present, I think one of the reasons this is important is that we have to remember that for 10,000 years, our most important mechanism for adaptation was our morality and our engagement with what our expectations of our life should be, right? And so we can't, I think that in the last 60, 70 years, we've gotten into the habit of thinking that most of these things get solved by somebody with a white coat somewhere else. But the past, I think, tells us that these are profound existential questions that are really political with the big P. They have to be part of everybody's kind of ethical and moral makeup, if you will. And that becomes particularly evident, I'll touch on this finally, in the experience of Rome. I'm Italian, Lynn, so as you well know, so I couldn't avoid sort of engaging in a bit of, parochial history. But the Roman Republic is, to me, an incredibly interesting archetype for modernity. And by the way, the United States, of course, is the model republic that plays that role in modernity, right? So, I mean, there's a lot to say there. But the Roman Republic was really wrestling with this issue that you raised about the balance between individual liberty and collective action. Now, one has to be careful. The liberty that the Romans were talking about had nothing to do with the freedoms of the liberal tradition that, of the John Locke's of this world that sort of eventually sort of made their way into the Western United States. But it's still interesting that the construct of a republic is fundamentally about finding that mediated balance between the liberty of action of individuals based on property rights, now as it was in Rome, and the need of a state to pursue a commonwealth, to pursue a public good that has to be delivered to all of its citizens, all of its members. In the case of Rome, of course, not everybody was a citizen, and arguably it's still in part of the problem today, but nevertheless, it was there. So I think, the sort of Republican experience of antiquity, as the Federalist writers knew, is, I think, very, very relevant even to the environmental kind of challenges of the 21st century. Does that answer you? You had a very complicated question there. But
it was complicated, but I want to probe it a little bit further. During my time at the Interior Department, of course, throw a dart on the map, and there probably was a water issue, and almost all of those issues had conflict as their framing. And indeed, there's a much used adage that says something to the effect in the West that whiskey's for drinking and water's for war. I want to probe a little bit more that dynamic between the individual and the collective, and again, come back to the United States for the conversation. So the Colorado River provides water to 7 states up and down the Western United States. And way back in the 1920s, there was a deal struck among those states recognizing, oh my goodness, we have to figure out how to be sure that all those states in the South that are where a lot of the agricultural production is or could be, get water, and that all those states in the North don't somehow dam all that water up, take the hydropower, and none gets delivered south. But, ratchet forward a whole bunch of years, and we see a collision course, partly because the water conditions way back then actually were more plentiful than they are right now. So the allocations to the states actually don't match up with the current situation. But to try and address this problem, on the one hand, the Secretary of the Interior, who's the master of that Colorado River, through kind of collective action and working with the states, had to develop an agreement to share shortages.
Yeah.
But where that collides with individual action is that for that to work, all the farmers in the Imperial Valley of California had to undertake changes in practices on their farms. And so whether you zero in on that particular example or others, I'd love to hear a little bit more about how that dynamic has played out, and where has it played out more successfully? What can we learn from that as we now really around the world are grappling with that tension in the context of drought and flood?
I mean, a couple of thoughts. First of all, it's sort of interesting to note that solutions, I mean, one of the big learnings for me is just history just demonstrates just how provisional solutions always are, right? Because, I mean, the solution that was found in the progressive era and then in the 1920s when Hoover was chairing that compact, which seemed like a colossal success at the time. And in many ways it was. I mean, if history is inevitably path dependent, and that sort of compact and the infrastructure that then was built subsequently, really enabled the development of the West in a way that, not even John Wesley Powell would have imagined, right? So, I mean, at some level, it was incredibly successful, but it's like everything in water, it sowed the seeds of its own destruction, because that success then tested the solution until we got to where we are today, where we discover, as you said, that the average climatology of the basin is about 10% lower than the particular decade in which the compact was agreed to, and everybody wrote in volumetric commitments and so forth, so on. And then, of course, as you well mentioned, and you know this better than me, it's not just the United States situation is unusual also because, unlike other countries, it's actually trying to solve a federal problem, right? So there's you have multiple layers of governance that are sort of embedded in this issue, which complicate the thing even further. So what do we learn from that? Well, first of all, I think that from various parts of history, I would say there's maybe three things I'll say. First of all, it has always been the case that, particularly when it comes to scarcity like this, you cannot really think about the management of a system absent a view of the productive economy in which it's used. So what is it that the water is used for is a really important question, right? If you assume that the problem is the zero-sum game that needs to be solved, fixing everybody's vision as to what their particular future looks like, the degrees of freedom becomes almost none. But if you ask yourself, can we have a debate about what the collective future needs to look like, then you expand that. And this was true in Rome, right? Rome's problems of food and water security were solved not through infrastructure, but through trade. For the most part, and incidentally, that's the same way in which the Middle East today mostly solves its water scarcity problems. I mean, I wouldn't elevate this, Lynn, as an example to follow, but I will note that Dubai, exists. Its territory could probably support 20,000 people, but 10 million people live on it because, you essentially depend on water that grows food somewhere else, right? And so that it's not necessarily a model, but all I'm saying is that you can't really answer these questions without having a conversation about what the landscape is being used for. And so that's one important aspect of this. The second aspect, which I'll kind of bring into this, is that over time, certainly since the sort of Middle Ages, since the 11th, 12th century, when the germs of the modern nation state started appearing, and when the germs of modern constitutionalism started appearing, it's been clear that you can't really solve these fundamental problems of sovereignty, because that's what they are. When you say the interior acts as the master, well, it acts as the sovereign, right? I mean, this is a Hobbesian state. It's constructed to kind of exercise ultimate sovereignty of the landscape and over its waters. One of the things that have emerged for me in writing this book is that over and over and over again, these issues are fundamentally constitutional issues, meaning that they are issues of civic compact, right? They can't just be about negotiating at the margins of who gets what. They have to be about also negotiating the rules, and in some case, the legal rules. Now, in the United States, in the Western United States, that's a particularly complicated and sort of burdened history, right? So the history of law in the West is something I'm not obviously a deep expert of the water law of the West, but it's a particularly broad body of jurisprudence. But that in part is where the solution to this thing lies, is in thinking hard about whether the legal frameworks, all the way down to the most foundational, which are the constitutional frameworks, are fit for purpose in confronting this challenge. Last thing I'll note is that there are a number of states in the US that have wrestled with the constitutional issue of water and environment. The federal government hasn't. And my guess is that over the next 100 years, we won't be around to see the end of it, but I suspect that constitutional issues for which at the heart there is environment and water will become more prominent as climate change forces us to think about this in more fundamental ways.
So, Julie, I want to go back to your main thesis, that is that water is not primarily a technological matter. It is a political matter, of course, which builds upon what you've just said. But bring in the matter of nature and environment. And one of the other statements that you make in the book, and you weave it through here and there, is that you say engineering gives us the illusion of emancipation from nature. And we, of course, in the United States saw that playing out with major themes in the progressive era and through the 20th century, the big era of dam building and irrigation facilities. But of course, it's not an illusion only in the United States. We've seen it in China. We've seen it in many other places. Speak to that a little bit more, that engineering gives the illusion of emancipation from nature and some of the lessons of that insight to what we're grappling with today as the climate changes, indeed as California fights fires, and part of that is linked to water and so forth.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, if you look at the kind of state expenditures over the first half of the 20th century, states were not, by states, I mean countries, like nations, were not significant economic players until the 20s, 30s, and 40s of the 20th century. Before then, the nation state wasn't a particularly relevant economic actor. And one of the things it does, the 20th century nation state, is it turns itself, for the most part, into a hydraulic state. In other words, it uses its financial resources. And interestingly, there's a kind of complicated connection to monetary policy and to a bunch of other things, but it uses its underwriting capability to transform the environment, right? And so thanks in particular to the leadership of the United States and the sort of modernist thesis of the progressive era, of this idea that you could essentially conquer nature, we went from a world in which pretty much no water was caught. Like at the beginning of the 1900s, the biggest dam in the world in 1904 was Lower Aswan Dam, which is a masonry dam on the Nile. It's a tiny thing by sort of modern standards. By the time you get to the 1970s and 80s, less than a century later, we catch a fifth of anything that comes down from the sky on land. We've literally replumbed the planet, so much so that for the first time in human history, you and I suspect everybody that's listening to us, doesn't have to wade even the tiniest stream to go to work. That is an unusual place to be in the history of humanity. And it's this constructed landscape that gives the impression that water just sits behind the dams and sits behind the levees, right? And as with everything in water, as I said earlier, every solution has the seeds of its destruction. What that has done has given this sense of absolute security, which has then led society to overinvest in the shadow of that protection. And so you see this in the West, plentiful water, anybody can move to California, there's no limit, we can grow anything. You can see this in the Rhine in Germany, you can build up to the very levees that will eventually one day fall. And if there's one thing you know from the story of water is that, as I said earlier, solutions are always provisional. Eventually, something's going to happen. Eventually, Storm Ida is going to come across New York and show you that actually the flood management and storm management of the city is simply not fit for purpose when a tropical storm comes through. And that's what's happening now. With the added interesting twist that climate change has accelerated the pace at which those solutions are being tested. And so one of the things that emerges for me is that for 10,000, as I said, we became sedentary 10,000 years ago. We start wrestling with these questions. And then in the 20th century, we sort of forget about it. Most of us sort of, after 9,900 years of essentially having the daily issue of dealing as a society with water, suddenly we think we're done. We've solved it everywhere, right? And we now discover that's not true. We're not done at all. And the solutions that we've set up in the 20th century have largely run their course. Now, this story can bifurcate at this point. Because there's one story that's playing out right now in much of the developing world, which is that China has inherited that modernist torch. Today, the biggest builders of dams are Chinese, and they have bought into the 20th century modernist project that America had pursued for so long. And so they are going around, after successfully replumbing China itself, they're now going around the world, replumbing Africa and replumbing South Asia and replumbing much of Latin America. Incidentally, alongside other renewable energy and sort of other modifications of the landscape that you and I know quite well. That's kind of one track. And if we leave it down that route, what will happen is we'll have a 21st century of further replumbing and further transformation of the landscape. The question is there an alternative? And maybe an alternative does exist. And it's probably a combination of different solutions that come from different times, right? Part of it is something that you and I have worked on for many, many years, which is the integration of ecosystems in life, right? Just like we left water out of the picture, we also left all ecosystems out of the picture. All of our cities are paved over with cement so that we don't have to worry about nature. So one question is, should the natural world be a bigger part of our life, right? Because the natural world offers a bunch of services in dealing with water. But there's another part of that story, which is the oldest and most effective form of adaptation is some form of acceptance. In other words, I think that there's also the sense that we have to come to terms with a more variable environment and understand what that means for our lives and for the institutions that we need to manage that. Be that, banal insurance, be that also just the pace of life and how we live. So, I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know where it's going to end up, but I do think that what we've seen in California and New York and other places is the harbinger of much more to come and much more fundamental questions about what our relationship with the environment ought to be.
So I want to build on that a little bit more, Giulio, your introduction of ecosystems, of nature back into the picture. And so we had in the 20th century, again, whether it was in the Asia-Pacific region or North America or indeed Europe, so much technological approach to water management, the building of dams, the building of levees, the building of canals, the building of all of these structures that would somehow mold, meld, shape water to deliver it and or to prevent it from flooding. And with some of the insight that you just mentioned, we are now beginning to see the introduction of the idea that we could perhaps blend those structures with concepts of nature. And so China now has advanced what it calls sponge city, trying to create permeable surfacing, trying to replant natural systems. Those systems can help manage stormwater, for example. We see lots of places now striving to engage in floodplain restoration so that the floods can once again spread out and act more like they might have without the intervention of man. So is that evolution, does that evolution hold significant promise as we try to address flooding and drought and all of these challenges? Or is that just tinkering at the margin? What do you see as the potential for that reshaping and broadening of how we think of nature and infrastructure and human civilization?
Well, I mean, I think it does hold promise. And I should say it's not as new as people sometimes think. I mean, if you think about, probably the most famous and most important project that really opened up the progressive era was the Panama Canal. And the Panama Canal is designed as an integration, whether, by design or by chance, but it is an integration of natural and artificial ecosystem. The Panama Canal at the time was the biggest piece of infrastructure ever built. It connected two oceans. But Stevens was the engineer, and he proposed this lock that had to go up at the level of the ridge as opposed to cutting through the mountains to get to the other side, as had been done in Suez. But the only way you could do that is if you had a river and a natural ecosystem that could continuously provide the water. And so it turns out that the Panama Canal, which is even today the anchor of global trade between the Pacific and the Atlantic, functions because the Mesoamerican forest releases water into the Tigris River, which then fills up Gatun Lake and provides the water for the locks. So, at the heart of global trade sits a forest, right? I mean, that's the story of the Panama Canal. And of course, you and I then know all the stories of the Catskills and, of the even Hetch Hetchy in San Francisco there, like the number of places that behind the scenes, when you ask the technical people, they will tell you, well, no, the ecosystems play an important role here. Now, the important thing is that we recognize that it is still an anthropocentric view of the world, right? There's a human prejudice. The role of nature is in service of human well-being. I'm a passionate environmentalist, but I care about the people more than I care about anything else. And so to me, this is not about, leaving nature be and just kind of separating people from nature for the sake of nature. To me, this is about recognizing the functional role of ecological integrity. And I think we have plenty of evidence that there is a lot of it. Now, the thing that makes this complicated is that ecosystems are extensive. They cover a lot of ground. And so what ends up happening is that often if you want to integrate nature into functional infrastructure, you need an act of sovereignty. You need somebody to come along and say, well, this is what we're going to do with this. Absent that, you need a compact, you need a civic compact amongst all the owners of the landscape to actually agree that that's the way in which the landscape will be used. And so it poses at its heart a civic problem, right? And to me, that's where the excitement of these kind of things lie. If we can enroll people in that vision, then I think it's a scalable solution.
So I'd like to turn to those that are listening to this conversation and see if anyone has any questions. Please put a question in the chat if you have one. You're welcome to do so now, and we'll turn to those. While you do that, I want to ask Giulio you one more line of question. You alluded to this a little bit when you mentioned the Catskills, when you mentioned the financing of some of these water systems. And there's an absolutely fascinating part of the book in which you actually end up with JP Morgan Chase. We all know that, biggest bank in the world, and so on and so forth. Yeah. But you trace it back to way back the Erie Canal and then private water investments, and the development of concept of bonds and sort of public-private partnerships. I'd love you to trace that a little bit, and then we will turn to some of those asking questions.
Well, I mean, I think that a lot of our relationship with water was really set in the 19th century, which is the age, in many ways, of liberalism. And so the Brits first, and then the American made it a practice of solving a lot of these problems through the instruments of corporate law and private practice. And so, particularly in the 1830s and 40s, there was a kind of a plethora of canal companies all along the eastern seaboard of America. There were private companies that were connecting the eastern seaboard to the interior, to the Ohio Valley first, and then to the rest of the country. And the Erie Canal, of course, was one of these. It was extraordinarily successful. Most of the others went bust in the various financial crises, and so there was this belief that for much of the 19th century, that you could use private capital and the sort of basically the corporation as a mechanism to provide these public services. So when the question came of public utility, of providing clean water to cities, this starts really in the 1850s and 60s, when people start realizing that cholera is caused by waterborne diseases. Then in America in particular, two different models emerge. One of them, which is championed by Benjamin Franklin, is kind of the public utility model, which is essentially the municipality raises taxes and pays for the supply of clean water. That ends up not becoming the dominant model until the end of the century. In the meantime, people, particularly in New York and other big cities, ended up with the same model that London had, which was a bunch of private companies. One of them was Aaron Burr's Manhattan Water Company, which was in part kind of steeped in the kind of debates about federalism and kind of the politics of the time. But it was designed initially as a vehicle, as a financial vehicle to underwrite the delivery of water. As far as I know, it failed as a water company. It didn't work very well. But as you suggest, it continued to raise money, and it very quickly turned into a bank, and that then became a Chase Bank, and then from Chase merged into a piece of JP Morgan to become JP Morgan Chase. And so, in fact, the biggest bank in America, and maybe one of the biggest in the world, has its roots, as much of the world, as I show in this book, in water.
So, Giulio, I just love that tale. And to everyone listening, this is the sort of richness that's in this book. You can follow so many strands and learn about history, learn about technology, learn about finance, learn about political philosophy. There's just so much in there. But we do have a question, and it's a technology question. So as places like California, but certainly many, many other places struggle with drought, the absence of reliable water over time, we are aware of the advent of desalination. And of course, places like Saudi Arabia utilize desal quite a bit. In the United States, been little forays into desal, often considered quite expensive. Can you talk a little bit about that, but more particularly as we continue to look at questions of water transport, water capture, are there any emerging solutions that you are aware of that people might not yet be familiar with, but that you see as holding promise, whether they are a mixture of sort of institutional design and technology or just technology?
Well, there are many, and I think one of the things that's interesting about water is that water is not one thing. It's experienced by different people in different ways. Water has different value to different people. And so the solution are as varied as the problems that people face, right? And so it's always going to be a kind of portfolio of many, many different things to solve many different sort of micro solutions. In that context, one slice of the problem, of course, is the provision of polished water, very, very sort of high quality, high reliability water that's available all the time at the very, very high quality. Incidentally, that's not the majority of the need, right? The majority of the need is water for agriculture, which is 98% of the consumptive use, and it doesn't need to be available all the time, and it doesn't need to be necessarily polished to drinking levels, right? But in the sort of supply of very clean, reliable water, of course, desalination plays an important role. It is expensive. Costs have been coming down over time as technology has improved, but there are some limits, some basic physical limits to how much energy needs to be expended to extract a very tiny molecule, like the molecule of salt, from water. And for that reason, there seems to be a floor around 20 to 30 cents per cubic meter that you can't really go below. I may stand corrected at some point, but at the moment that seems to be the case. But there are other, but that sort of focus on trying to extract water from polluted water has led then to a kind of a whole generation of technologies that then focus on extracting other molecules from the water stream. And so the reuse of wastewater, for example, is a very important and promising avenue. It's less expensive than desalination because most of the molecules that you take out of waste stream are bigger. And so you require less energy to take them out. And it's proving to be, reuse proves to be a really important piece of the solution, one that's more popular and more present in the Middle East than it is in the United States at the moment, but that most likely will play a bigger and bigger role going forward. I should say, though, that all these solutions address, the sort of urban and industrial use, which are really the minority of the water use. The vast majority is for stuff that grows, right? It's for agriculture. As I said, consumptive use, it's around 98% is for agriculture. And there, you can't really, the foods that we all enjoy is heavily subsidized because we don't pay for the cost of the infrastructure that delivers the water to it. Were we to add desalination or reuse to agriculture at scale, we'd make food, we'd either bankrupt the state or make food essentially unaffordable. And so these solutions have to be institutional. And so, we could, there's a longer discussion about markets and the various ways in which you can try and solve this. But that's where the number of the issue is.
Giulio, I love that you mentioned recycled water. As it so happens, earlier today I was touring the renovated main headquarters of the Nature Conservancy, where we have installed a recycled water system. So
Nice.
Very timely. I'd like to end on a global note. With the challenges of water, at one point you note that in some respects, you earlier said vulnerable populations are really significant and drove a lot of the history of water. Africa is a place with those vulnerabilities, and you call it in your book the canary in the coal mine. And I wonder if you could just say quickly, because we're running out of time, a few words about the world around us, our global response to the crises that we see, and maybe a few words about Africa, and then we'll wrap up.
Sure. Yeah, no, for sure. And, I sort of end the book there in many ways, because that's where the 21st century will play out, in the way in which the various developed and developing and middle-income countries like China and the United States sort of show up in trying to help the poorest in the world cope with a changing climate, and one that's changing faster and faster. And I don't have great solutions there, other than to say that that's where Europe is only a narrow sea away from North Africa. The African continent in 1950s, Europe had twice the population of Africa. Today, Africa has twice the population of Europe. The demographic pressures alone are setting up a problem. If we don't make sedentism persistent possible, and the self-fulfillment and self-determination possible in the poorest countries of the world, they will become the sea peoples of the 21st century. They will move. They will have to. And so water is really a fundamental platform for development. And that's why I think it matters so much.
Thank you. That's a great note to end on. And Alison, over to you. And I really want to thank Giulio for a great conversation and a wonderful book.
Absolutely. Thank both of you so much. This was such a great conversation. And I really appreciate that you brought in both the historical perspective as well as making it relevant to our current crises in the US and globally. So thank you so much. And I would really want to encourage you all to purchase this book. It's incredible. So much research has gone into it. It will answer all your questions, and we have it available. Book Passage, you can purchase it in our store. We are open at both our stores in San Francisco Ferry Building, as well as our main store in Corte Madera. You can also call us, order it online, all kinds of things. So please support the bookstore as well as supporting our author by purchasing this book. It'll be a wonderful book for the holidays, which are coming up. So remember that. And thank you both again. Everybody stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you for our next talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.